The night over Germany was not quiet. Somewhere above a broken carpet of burning towns and searchlight cones, a British Lancaster bomber droned through the darkness, its 4 Merlin engines humming at a steady, comforting note. Inside, the crew moved in a well-rehearsed rhythm. Navigator bent over his charts. Wireless operator listening for the distant murmur of orders. Pilot watching the dim red glow of his instruments. They knew they were in danger, but they also believed they understood that danger. Flak bursts at predictable altitudes. Night fighters that had to be guided in by ground radar, then feel their way forward through the black. Maybe they'd see a silhouette, maybe they wouldn't. Maybe the German pilot would miss. What they did not expect was an enemy that could see in the dark, far below and ahead, on a strip in occupied Holland. Another crew strapped into a strange, angular aircraft with antennae bristling from its nose. The pilot and radar operator sat back-to-back in a pressurized cockpit. Unusual ejection seats beneath them. The first operational ones on any combat aircraft in the world. In front of them, a green radar screen glowed. A cluster of dots marked a bomber stream they could not see with their eyes at all. With a push of the throttles, their Heinkel He-219 Uhu, the eagle owl, lunged into the sky, climbing into the dark to hunt ghosts it had already found by radio waves. Within an hour, Major Werner Streib would bring that prototype down again, with 5 Lancasters claimed in a single sortie, one night fighter taking apart a piece of bomber command almost on its own. Most people have never heard of the He-219. Yeah, it flew in tiny numbers. It never became the symbol of a nation the way a Spitfire or a B-17 did. And yet, up there in the glare of exploding cities and burning aircraft, it quietly rewrote what night combat could be. In this video, we're not going to talk about the usual World War II icons. No Spitfires versus Messerschmitts, no endless footage of flying fortresses or V-2 rockets. Instead, we're going to walk through the shadows, to look at the obscure warplanes and rockets that bent the shape of the war, then vanished from most documentaries. A night fighter that almost saved Germany's skies, but arrived too late. A rocket-powered interceptor so fast it scared its own pilots. A human-guided rocket bomb that turned the sea around Okinawa into a place of quiet dread. And a pair of simple, unguided rockets that gave fighter pilots the punch of artillery batteries and changed how ground attack would work for decades. Let's start where we already are, in the dark. The Heinkel He-219 didn't begin life as a night fighter at all. In 1940, Heinkel's designers dreamed up a sleek, multi-role aircraft called the P-1055. Fast, pressurized, with tricycle landing gear and even planned ejection seats. It was too radical for the German Air Ministry and was shelved. Then British Bomber Command turned much of Germany into a target. By 1942 to 43, night raids over cities like Hamburg and Berlin were stretching existing German night fighters to their limits. The Luftwaffe needed something new. The old paper project was dusted off and reborn as the HE-219, a dedicated night fighter with a crew of 2, powerful Daimler-Benz engines, and the Liechtenstein SN-2 radar system in its nose. The radar could pick up bomber-sized targets several kilometers away, enough that a single fighter, once steered into the general area by ground control, could hunt on its own, using its own eyes in the dark. On paper, it was brutal. Up to 8 cannons, 4 20mm and 4 30mm, pointing forward or mounted obliquely in the fuselage so they could fire upward into the vulnerable bellies of bombers. A tricycle landing gear that made night takeoffs safer. And those ejection seats, fired by compressed air, that offered night fighter crews at least a slim margin of survival when their aircraft was hit amid the flak and fire. Imagine sitting in that cockpit on operations. The world outside is pitch black. Yet the only light is the faint green circle of the radar and the occasional flash of distant flak. Your radar operator calls out a target. Contact range 4 kilometers, bearing 270, closing. At a closure rate of perhaps 600 to 700 kilometers per hour, your speed plus the bombers, that range can shrink from 4 kilometers to 1 in about 20 seconds. In those 20 seconds, you're adjusting throttle, nudging the controls, trying to slide into a point in space just behind and below a bomber that still has no idea you're there. When Strib took the HE-219 prototype into combat in June 1943, he used that combination of radar and heavy armament to devastating effect. In the space of about 77 minutes, he claimed 5 Lancasters before crashing on landing. In the first few nights of operations, our 3 HE-219s were credited with around 20 RAF bombers, including several of the previously untouchable Mosquito fighter bombers whose speed had made them almost immune to earlier German night fighters. Within Bomber Command, rumors began to spread. A new German night fighter with its own radar, cannons firing up from below, and pilots who seemed to find bombers in the dark as if they'd been handed a map. For crews already living on the edge of fear, it was another thing to worry about, something unseen, hunting them from angles they weren't used to defending. And yet, the He-219 never appeared in the numbers that mattered. Political infighting, competing projects, and its relatively complex construction meant production was slow and constantly threatened. In all, only about 268 were built. So you get this strange paradox. One of the most advanced piston-engine night fighters of the war, possibly capable of inflicting serious damage on the Allied bombing campaign if deployed widely, ends up fighting as a rare bird. Pilots who flew it loved it. Historians sometimes call it a misjudged genius. But to most people, the eagle owl never even appears on the war's mental map, while the HE-219 was stalking bomber streams in the night. Other German engineers were working on something that didn't stalk at all. It pounced. If the He-219 was an owl, the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet was a lightning bolt. Designed by Alexander Lippisch and his team, it started as a tailless glider experiment before being married to a Walter rocket engine. The result that was something unlike any other operational combat aircraft in history, the world's first and only rocket-powered fighter to enter service. On its first powered flights in 1941, the Me 163 demonstrated speeds over 1,000 kilometers per hour in level flight, faster than any jet in service at the time, and far beyond what propeller-driven fighters could manage. In 1944, a test pilot reached around 1,130 kilometers per hour, an unofficial record that wouldn't be surpassed by turbojets until the early 1950s. But that speed came with brutal trade-offs. The rocket engine's propellants were extraordinarily volatile and corrosive. Leaks could dissolve a pilot's flight suit or his skin. The Me 163 carried enough fuel for roughly 7.5 minutes of powered flight. After that, it was a glider, a very fast, unarmed glider that had to get back to a runway through a sky full of enemies. Picture the experience for a new Komet pilot. You're strapped into a small cockpit, sitting on top of a tank full of chemicals that will happily eat through metal and flesh. You're towed into the air by a Messerschmitt Bf-110 like some strange parasite, released, then you ignite the rocket. The world compresses. The acceleration shoves you into your seat. In maybe 3 minutes, you can climb from ground level to 10,000 meters or more, punching up through the bomber stream so quickly that you have only seconds in which your guns are in range. If you misjudge, you might have time for one more attack on the way back down before your fuel runs out. The numbers are cold. Roughly 370 Me 163s were built. Depending on the source, they achieved somewhere between 9 and 18 confirmed aerial victories, while losing at least 10 aircraft in combat and many more in accidents. But numbers alone don't tell you how it felt to face one. Imagine sitting in a B-17 over Germany in late 1944. You're used to diving attacks by Bf-109s and FW-190s. You know the rhythm of those fights. Then your tail gunner calls out something that doesn't fit. a tiny, swept-wing shape streaking straight up through the formation, too fast for his guns to track. A flash of cannon fire, a bomber in the next box jolting. Then the little dart is already a speck, carving a vertical arc into the sky. Whispers spread through the crews. Rocket planes. Superweapons. In reality, the Me-163 was less a practical weapon than a glimpse of the future. It showed what a rocket-propelled interceptor could do in terms of climb rate and raw performance, but it also showed how hard that was to turn into real combat success. The technology would scatter into post-war research on high-speed flight, gliders, and eventually spaceplanes. The Komet itself was scrapped, captured, or left to rot on abandoned airfields. Yet for a brief moment in 1944, it forced Allied planners to imagine a sky where even their fastest escorts might not be enough. If you're still with me and you enjoy these forgotten corners of World War II, the machines that sat halfway between experiment and legend, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. It helps this channel keep digging up stories that don't fit on the usual highlight reel. Now, we're going to leave the European skies behind and head somewhere very different. A gray sea, studded with ships, off an island called Okinawa. On the decks of U.S. Navy destroyers and transports, in 1945, there was a new kind of nervousness. Pilots and sailors had been facing Japanese attacks for years, but the last phase of the Pacific War added something else: the organized mass use of kamikaze tactics. Among the many aircraft thrown into those desperate attacks, one stood out as particularly unsettling. It looked less like an airplane and more like a bomb with wings. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, Cherry Blossom, was a purpose-built, rocket-powered, human-guided anti-ship weapon. Not a conventional bomber. Not a missile in the modern sense. A man climbed into it, took off attached to a larger aircraft, and expected never to come back. Solely because its rocket motors gave it enormous speed, but only for a short time, the Oka had to be carried into the vicinity of the target, slung under a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. Once close enough, the pilot would detach, ignite 3 solid-fuel rocket motors, and dive toward a ship with a warhead of around 1,200 kilograms of explosives in the nose. At top speed, level flight performance could reach roughly 650 kilometers per hour, with diving attacks pushing well over 900. Here's a simple way to feel the timing. In its final dive, an Oka pilot might have engines burning for perhaps 8 to 10 seconds. At, say, 250 meters per second, that's only 2 to 2.5 kilometers of powered plunge. If you're on the bridge of a destroyer, you could go from spotting a tiny dot skimming the waves to having that warhead hit your hull in well under half a minute. In theory, that was the terrifying genius of the design. So fast in the terminal phase that anti-aircraft gunners and maneuvering captains would have almost no time to react. In practice, it created a different vulnerability. The Betty bombers carrying Okas were slow, fragile, and had to approach within about 37 kilometers of the target to launch, well inside the reach of American carrier fighters and radar-directed anti-aircraft fire. Again and again, U.S. pilots learned to intercept the carriers before the Okas could be released. Many Oka pilots died without ever seeing a ship through their gun sight. Even so, when they did get through, especially in the battles around Okinawa, the effect could be horrific. Several destroyers and support ships were sunk or badly damaged. Crews remembered the strange, stubby shapes streaking in, and the sense that this was something different. Not a bomber dropping a load and trying to escape, but a human being riding a rocket straight at them. About 852 Okas were built. Most never found a target. None sank a major fleet carrier or battleship. As a weapon system, the design was arguably a dead end, but as a symbol of how far a beleaguered nation would go, and as a psychological presence on the decks of Allied ships, it left a deeper mark than its statistics suggest. It also raised difficult moral questions that still echo: when is a weapon inhuman. Is a human-guided rocket inherently more terrible than a high-altitude bombing raid that kills civilians by the hundreds? Or is it the intimacy, the visible knowledge that someone chose to ride that weapon into their own death, that makes it feel worse? While these rocket weapons were testing the limits of what a pilot could endure, another machine in German service was quietly changing the future in a different way, not with suicidal speed, but with calm, high-altitude observation. The Arado R-234 Blitz, Lightning, was the world's first operational jet-powered bomber. It entered service late in the war in 1944, and its story is one of those footnotes that shouldn't be a footnote at all. Originally ordered as a high-speed reconnaissance aircraft, the R-234 was designed around two Junkers, Jumo 004 turbojet engines slung under a slim fuselage. In its reconnaissance form, it could cruise at speeds of around 740 kilometers per hour, faster than most Allied fighters, and at altitudes that made interception difficult. In the summer of 1944, R-234s flew some of the first jet reconnaissance missions over the Normandy front and later over the Ardennes, photographing Allied positions with a freedom that shocked planners used to thinking that radar and fighters could at least threaten any reconnaissance aircraft. Later, in its bomber variant, small groups of AR-234s carried out precision attacks, most famously against the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945, racing in to drop 1,100-pound bombs and then simply outrunning many defenders on the way out. It didn't save the bridge, and it didn't change the war. There were too few aircraft, too little fuel, and not enough time. Yeah, but every Allied intelligence officer who pored over those photos knew what they were looking at: the future. A world where reconnaissance and strike aircraft would rely on speed and altitude, on jet engines and sleek forms, rather than armor and sheer numbers. The AR-234's lineage flows directly into the post-war generation of jet bombers and reconnaissance platforms on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It's a ghost in the machine of the Cold War, a design most people have never heard of, even though its descendants defined the nuclear age. If the R-234 whispered about the future from high altitude, there were other weapons much closer to the ground, crude, cheap, and unguided, that changed daily life for soldiers in ways just as profound. Take the British RP-3 rocket projectile. On paper, yes, it was simple. A 3-inch steel tube filled with cordite propellant, screwed into a variety of warheads. The most famous was the 60-pounder, a semi-armor-piercing high-explosive head weighing around 27 kilograms. The whole rocket measured just over 1.4 meters long. Bolt 8 of these to the wings of a Hawker Typhoon fighter bomber, and suddenly a single pilot now had the ability to fling nearly 220 kilograms of explosives at a column of tanks or a German U-boat with one trigger pull. In terms of pure explosive weight, that was roughly equivalent to dozens of 25-pounder artillery shells arriving almost simultaneously in a space no wider than a country road. The rockets were unguided, and frankly, not very precise. Pilots had to dive at the right angle, at the right speed, stabilize the aircraft. They could fire within a narrow window if they wanted their salvo to hit anything smaller than a railway yard. Trajectory drop over distance was significant. Side slip or yaw could send rounds wide. But accuracy wasn't always the main point. In the Western Desert and then across Normandy and the Falaise Pocket in 1944, Typhoons firing RP-3s became a kind of flying siege engine. Tank crews who once feared high-velocity anti-tank guns now flinched at the sight, and more importantly the sound, of rockets streaking in, the noise of their motors, followed by multiple simultaneous explosions. German soldiers described the attacks as demoralizing. Whether or not a rocket hit, the psychological effect of hearing dozens of them roar in at once could break up an attack or panic a retreat. The same basic rocket turned up in stranger places. Yet in 1944 to 45, British engineers and guards officers mounted RP-3 rails on Sherman tanks, creating the so-called Sherman Tulip. These makeshift rocket tanks used their new teeth not for pinpoint gunnery, but for short-range area bombardment at the Rhine crossing, hurling pairs or quartets of rockets into suspected ambush positions before advancing. Their accuracy was questionable. Their ability to terrify anyone in the impact zone was not. Across the Atlantic, American engineers were following a similar path, but with a twist. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces wanted a rocket that flew faster and flatter than earlier designs, making it easier for pilots to aim. At Caltech, researchers developed the High-Velocity Aircraft Rocket, HVAR, nicknamed Holy Moses. It kept the 5-inch diameter warhead used on naval guns, but mounted it on a new 5-inch rocket motor, increasing the propellant load almost threefold compared to its predecessor. A complete HVAR weighed about 61 kilograms, with roughly 20 kilograms for the warhead and a smaller core of high explosive, on the order of 3.5 kilograms, inside that shell. When fired, it could reach speeds of around 950 miles per hour and had a range of roughly 5 kilometers. The math here is simple, but telling. Imagine a Corsair or Hellcat diving on a bunker line, carrying 8 HVARs. In a single pass lasting just seconds, the pilot could deliver a string of warheads that each hit with enough force to punch through several feet of reinforced concrete or wreck a locomotive, all without the recoil and weight penalties of heavy onboard guns. If first used operationally by Allied fighters in France shortly after D-Day, HVARs would go on to become standard ground attack weapons in the Korean War as well, living a second life under the wings of early jets like the F-84 and F-9F. They proved that simple, unguided rockets, mass-produced and hung on almost any aircraft, could give air forces a flexible tool for smashing ground targets without risking big bombers. Today, when you see helicopter rocket pods or jet fighters carrying racks of unguided rockets, you're seeing an echo of those crude WWII designs. Refined, miniaturized, but conceptually similar. And that's a pattern that runs through all of these forgotten machines. The HE-219 took radar, ejection seats, and concentrated heavy armament and showed how devastating a purpose-built night fighter could be, even if politics kept it from reaching its potential. The Me-163 proved that rocket-powered interceptors were possible and painfully impractical, but pushed forward the boundaries of high-speed aerodynamics. The Oka showed both the extremes of human sacrifice and the limits of brute-force suicide weapons when faced with radar, fighters, and layered defenses. The AR-234 Blitz quietly demonstrated that speed and altitude, not armor, would define the next era of bombers and reconnaissance. And the humble RP-3 and HVAR turned the wings of fighters into launch rails for cheap, terrifying area attack weapons, shaping close air support into the jet age. Pause for a moment and think about what that really means. When we picture World War II, we tend to imagine the big, photogenic things, the iconic fighters dueling in clear skies, yes, the huge bombers over cities, the battleships firing great arcs of shells. But for the people actually there, bomber crews watching radar-guided night fighters appear out of nowhere, sailors staring down the nose of a diving rocket bomb, tankers hearing the rising hiss of incoming rockets. It was often these strange, in-between weapons that defined their fear. In an age of tanks, aircraft, and industrial slaughter, sometimes what men feared most was not the biggest weapon, but the one that broke the rules they thought they understood. The fighter that could see in the dark, the interceptor that moved too fast for their eyes to track, the rocket that turned a single pilot into a one-man artillery strike, the human-guided bomb that refuse even the illusion of mutual survival. These machines did not win the war by themselves. Many were fielded too late in too small numbers or with too many flaws. Some, like the Oka and the Komet, cost more lives among their own crews than they took from the enemy. But they nudged tactics, shaped doctrine, and left fingerprints on the weapons and ideas that followed. And they remind us of something uncomfortable, that in total war, ingenuity doesn't always point toward elegance or efficiency. Sometimes it points toward ever stranger ways to compress fear, speed, and destruction into a few seconds of contact between human beings. If this journey through the war's hidden machines felt worth your time, I'd invite you to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Which of these aircraft or rockets surprised you the most? And what other overlooked designs, primitive or advanced, do you think deserve their own deep dive?